Welcome back to The Fertile Dark, where we dive deep into the realms of psychology and human experience. I'm Krista, here with my co-host Daniel, and we're excited to share with you an interesting episode about spiral dynamics, and I'm interested to hear what questions it might evoke for you. We discussed spiral dynamics, which is a model of human development that allows us to see from different perspectives, and we discussed how curiosity plays an essential role in this process of development. We also talked about how it is important to integrate past levels that we have reached as we move forward in development so that we can continue on with loving compassion, all aspects of the human experience. So for those of you who struggle with relational challenges, find it hard to see the other's perspective, stay tuned to this episode. You won't want to miss it.
Well, why don't we start by giving just like a brief intro to spiral dynamics, just kind of talking about what it is and the role that it serves?
Yeah, absolutely. So spiral dynamics is a model of different ways that we look at the world. This theory explains how we grow and develop through these different levels, but also how we need to integrate these past levels or past altitudes that we can see from these different perspectives. And the idea is to kind of work toward gaining these different perspectives while also holding space for anybody who's in any other perspective.
So we're working with the theory of human development, individual, cultural, social. It's vertical in nature, shaped like a spiral. And we're representing development through a vertical ascension through the spiral.
Right. And the spiral is a kind of a funnel shape going upward. And to me, I see that as like these ever expanding circles where you can expand beyond yourself and you can connect more with others and you can encompass more perspectives as you go up through this kind of or spiral.
So interesting that you would put it that way. I feel like that's something that's danced in my mind a little bit around it, is that moving from the bottom of the spiral to the top, it's not just an elevated experience of development, but it's also a horizontal capacity, like a capacity to be able to hold more space, hold more ideas, which I think makes sense when you look at the spiral where it's coiled very tightly at the bottom, but then also like what the stages of development represent, how there would be much less space for any kind of expansion lower down in development. And for people who aren't super familiar with this particular model of development, there is both the shape of the spiral and then also it's color coded to represent different stages that people go through. The lowest being beige and then moving through red, purple, blue, green, orange, yellow, and then turquoise. Did I get that right?
Yeah, same. Those are the right colors. Just a little out of order, but yeah, you work through them.
Oh, I got them out of order. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So walk us through the right order of colors, because this is important. And I'm okay. At least beige is at the bottom.
Yeah. You were so close. Beige, purple, red, and then blue, orange, green.
Oh, yeah. Which makes sense. Okay. There we go. Which makes a lot more sense. So where beige is, we're like subsistence level living and development. It's like food, clothing, shelter, reproduction. Like that's where we're at. That's all we're capable of caring about, is basic like living needs.
Right.
And then purple is those needs are met. Now we're able to begin to expand and start to try and make sense of the world and interact with it in a new way.
Yeah.
And so do you want to walk through the colors and like maybe some of like what's going on at these different colors beyond beige?
Yeah. So beyond beige, there's purple, and this is a phase that is more about magic and seeing a spiritual soul within inanimate objects, the world is kind of mysterious and frightening in this stage. And so it makes sense to cling to ritual and tradition and symbols and to try to appease the gods and also to unite in your clan for safety. And in this stage, the individual is insubordinate to the group. Yeah. So purple's kind of this magical stage.
Yeah, it's like the tribal, superstitious, like ritual oriented stage.
Absolutely.
Which then builds into red, where we've moved from tribal into essentially like gangland, where it's like strength, dominance, power, and feels like we're moving from individual to group back to individual. So beige is very individual. And then in purple, we move where the individual is subordinate to the group. But then when we move out of purple into red, now it's back to the individual over the group and trying to establish power and dominance over others.
Yeah, I find that a very interesting pattern that we just naturally go between these pendulums of individualism and then collectivism. And we just kind of, that's our natural pattern to kind of go in these waves between the two. In this red state that you move into, you're egocentric. You're just, like your way matters the most. It's a dog eat dog world. It's a tough jungle out there. It's this feeling of needing to kind of claw your way to the top. And in a lot of organizations in the red state, there's like a top boss. You know, you said gangland. I mean, gangs are kind of in that red state where you have a top boss and it's a dog eat dog situation until you get to the top. But there is a lot of courage in this stage and determination and natural power. So it's an interesting stage for sure.
Yeah, it gives me like real like playground hierarchy vibes.
Yeah, definitely. And there are stages where in our life where we need to go back to it and kind of know how to operate within that stage or at that altitude, so to speak.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then red goes into blue, which that's where you have a very ethnocentric view, more fundamentalist belief systems, where we have, again, back to the collective, but it's from the more stereotypical gender roles rather than focus on the tribal mentality. We're focused more on maybe a religious belief system. Hey, what am I missing here on blue?
Yeah. In this stage, I would add that life is directed by a higher power of some sort, whether that's a focus on, God, religion, or that you need that higher power of the greater collective. So you become very loyal to groups that are similar to you and you find a natural loyalty and you want to bond with them. There's this idea of that you can connect with your purpose in that way, and you can even serve the greater good through self-sacrifice when you're at this stage for the sake of belonging and building that tribe or group. Yeah, and organizations that are blue are pyramid shaped, so you still have some of the hierarchy from the stage of red, but instead of it being this clawing to the top, there's a little more organization and respect in the process, like more mutual respect in the process, or at least of the system itself.
It seems like here we're looking at where purple was tribal in a way that seemed more like geographic or even familial as the nature of the group. Blue seems a little bit more group based on belief system. Like, what are the core values of the belief system? And everyone subservient to those values. And then if you reject those values, then you're then rejected by the group.
Yeah, that's a good point. Values do become something that the group bonds over those values, and rather than it just being out of family. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Which then the next stage from blue is into orange, where we go again from group focused to individual focused, where we're looking at like science, business, money, like climbing the ladder, individual success, science over religion. It always just gives me really like 80s vibes. Whenever I think about orange, I just think about like the big house, the fast car. We're always trying to like expand our scientific understanding of the world. We're trying to build the smallest computer possible. Like capitalist economy, where it is very much about like, yeah, that dream of like, I can be at the top through effort rather than compared to red, where red is like I'm at the top through power. Orange is I'm at the top through effort. Mm-hmm. Like a meritocracy almost.
Absolutely. There is that emphasis on effort and achievement through effort, through like you realize that perhaps you can achieve more or more in a healthier way for yourself when you approach it in this way. Yeah, there in the orange stage, there is a focus on capitalism and materialism. Motivations become economic, but it seems like it's more stemming from a place of success, achievement, or just trying to create something better, trying to leave a legacy, those kind of motivations. You start to see in this stage, you start to see competition as an opportunity for growth and that it enhances your productivity. So you really start to see challenge as something positive at this stage.
Which to me sounds like, again, an oppositional view to red, where competition is threatening. Competition needs to be eliminated. Here in orange, competition is an opportunity for advancement.
Absolutely.
Where rather than an obstacle that needs to be eliminated, it's the obstacle that becomes the way to move forward.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it also, looking from orange back to blue becomes something instead of bonding with these groups that you previously held so tightly, you start to almost create more competition within these groups and advance yourself as an individual. Like you kind of break away from that idea of, I find my identity with this group. You break into this idea of, I find my identity with my own effort, my own actions. So it's another jump from that collectivism to individualism, going from blue to orange.
Oh, if this fits, I guess and I can't remember, like my European history is really rough. Really any history in my mind is really rough. But there was the period in European history where I want to say it was the King of England was excommunicated. And then you have the formation of the Church of England. But as there was like this break with the Catholic Church because the king was prioritizing his individual status and his desires around that individual status over the desires and the instruction of the Pope, which feels like this move from blue to orange. Am I getting that right? Am I like way off base here? My historical knowledge.
From what I understand, I do believe I know what you're talking about, and it feels on point. Yeah, there was this break from the Catholic Church basically because of that idea. And I would associate that. I think that's a great example. This move from a feeling of blue, of loyalty and group and God above all, into kind of a more individual stance, an individual perspective or focus or motivation. Yeah.
I mean, even the Renaissance feels like the move from blue to orange as well. So as like another cultural example there, if we were to rewind the clock a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. You see that shift from religion or spiritual, focus to science and what the individual can create or produce. Absolutely. And like you said, the 80s, I think that's another example, a recent example where we can see this at the 80s in the US anyway, this huge shift to what an individual can achieve and just how much an individual can obtain and have and create. And I think we're starting to shift out of that, it seems, and go into green, which is more of a focus on community, more of a focus on equality for everyone. Yeah, there's this idea in the green space where there's a recognition that we all exist together and we affect each other. And so, again, leaving from that individualism, swinging back to the collectivism. But this time there's more focus on, instead of how we were in the blue stage, where it's more about being loyal to the group, this is less about loyalty and more about serving the group. And in my opinion, it seems like green is focused more on that.
Yeah, there's like that egalitarianism that's present. I would say like hippie culture is a great example of a green mindset. It's all about peace and love and unity and harmony and coming together and unburdening and unshackling from restrictive ideas and ideals and patterns of behavior, opportunity that's able to be shared around to both give like opportunity for voice and sharing of ideas and advancement, and all in that opportunity to engage and develop the group collectively and move away from what are considered harmful, idealistic, or ethnocentric ideals.
Definitely. And in the green stage, there's this focus on the value of all lives. And in seeing that, there is a little more opening up of perspective, but the green stage still has this limitation of my perspective is the way. That can still be kind of something that the green can develop into the next stage. That's kind of the next step for green, basically, is to come out of this, like, why can't everybody see that the world needs more peace? Things like that. So there's still this, this perspective opens up more, but it's still limited in a way.
I think it's interesting to consider that, like, how does somebody at a green stage of development see other people? Like in a stage blue, you've got like more black and white, where it's like you're either right or wrong. So it's like if you're part of the group, you're right, and if you're not part of the group, you're wrong. In green, it's like when you look at other people, like if I were to look up, just see a bunch of other people who are the same as me, even if they're more developed. And then, everybody's side to side. It's like, oh, we're all the same. We're all the same. And like, that's awesome. You're just like me. You're trying to make the world a better place. And then there is a tendency to look at lower stages of development almost through a lens of like, wow, you're barbaric. We need to cure you of your barbarism. You're a danger to yourself and everybody else. We need to cure you of your hatred. At each stage, there's the inability to see even at higher levels of development, like through green. And I think part of that is because spiral dynamics is divided into the two tiers.
So from tier 1, going into tier 2, there is this ability to hold multiple perspectives, respect the different values, the different motivations of each meme, basically. You become more flexible and creative because you can access those just different perspectives, and you can understand them when you're working with others, trying to build relationships with others. So there becomes a little more movement in tier 2 because you can hold these multiple perspectives at the same time. And I just do want to reiterate the point that you made about our natural tendency to look back at previous stages with disdain or trying to push them away or say that they're less than. It's really hard to talk about this, actually, because I have that natural inclination within myself to look back at my own previous centers of gravity, want to shun them, want to say that they're less than. So I'm very cautious about the words that I choose, such as, is weakness a good word for pointing out this blind spot? Like, blind spot might be a great word because as you gain altitude, you can see more. So it's really just these little blind spots at each level. And it's important to note that even if you step up into, let's say, from orange to green, you still fluctuate between these different levels. Or if you don't access them, then there becomes this issue because you're not accessing them and you're not utilizing them. So they're still a very fundamental part of how we need to express ourselves as humans. The point you made about that we need to integrate these and not shun these other parts that we've been through, I just want to point that out because I was even cautious about how how what I said came out.
And I think that is really important, right? That we realize that in our own personal development, that each of us has a center of gravity where we are kind of generally speaking in personal development, but we're really kind of scattered out a little bit across the spiral, like different aspects of who we are is a little scattered out. So there are some aspects of my life that are firmly rooted in like a developmentally blue place. And there are also parts of me that are very orange. I mean, my experience in the military was primarily orange based. It's all about climbing to the top through achievement, like personal achievement. And the military really reinforces that. I mean, if you look at my dress uniform, there is a very small area for unit awards and a very large place for individual awards. And if you just look at the picture of the front of my jacket for my dress uniform, the individual awards take up significantly more space than the unit awards, which just reinforces that idea of individual achievement. But where I would say my center of gravity would hopefully be is in that like green into yellow space. Like I'm working really hard at that developmental stage of being integrative and flexible and able to really be expansive and see like how do I create systems that can address problems. And I also realize that there's at least a part of my experience that is still blue. And there's also times when I find myself feeling very red, where we're going to solve this problem through a power struggle rather than maybe from a green place, like through a little bit more discourse. But yeah, I think when we see that in ourselves, when we see that we have a center of gravity, but that all of us are kind of spread out, and that we also see that at different developmental stages, it's really hard to see things in any other way. Like there's a lack of capability to see things in a different way. And we can have some more compassion for that and say, okay, this person is like locked and loaded in blue. They're pushing all of my hot buttons. And I can say, get that from a place of compassion and understanding rather than from getting really upset and aggressive.
Yeah, the word compassion comes to mind around the idea of just how complex it is for all of us to coexist peacefully, knowing how hard it can be to see another's perspective, knowing that many of us are not in this, including myself, are not in this upper tier. Like my center of gravity is not like in a space yet of where I can always hold this, and even if your center of gravity is, let's say, blue, you can have these moments where you can access that other perspective and you can understand it maybe, but it still is very complicated. You might even have the thoughts, but it becomes very complicated to operate from that. When somebody cuts you off driving, it's really hard to operate from anything beyond red. You might have thoughts that are more communally centered, but it can be hard not to have these other parts of yourselves come forward. And that's not a bad thing either. Those parts are there for a reason. I mean, if somebody is threatening your life in some way, crossing the boundaries of what makes you comfortable, it's nice that there's something that is a part of ourselves that can stand up for ourselves, that can hold these boundaries and say like, I am, and I need this much for myself. I need this much space or respect or whatever it might be. So, but it's really hard to hold that, knowing that we're in these different places and and have these blind spots to each other.
I agree. It can be really hard to be able to hold space for those blind spots in other people. And I guess it makes me think of a couple things. One is the idea of development through the spiral, like through this particular theoretical lens, like how that happens. Then also how oftentimes our reaction to other people's development, how that lets us know personal blind spots for our own individual development. So just because like spiral dynamics, the idea is that every level of development is built fundamentally on integrating the level previous. I guess the image that comes to mind for me around this is the idea of a snake. Like as it grows, it also sheds its skin. where there comes a space where a certain developmental stage, we've integrated it enough that it no longer fits us, and we begin to develop beyond it to address complex problems that are presenting themselves, that level of development no longer has the tools we need to address those problems. But sometimes, rather than focusing on integrating the essential capacities of a certain level, we reject those and try and jump ahead. But then what we end up doing is we then take the capacities associated with a previous developmental level, and through that experience of rejection, we stuff it in the shadow. And then when somebody else is kind of firmly in that place in a given moment, that part of us that's in the shadow comes out in an uncontrolled way. The next thing you know, I'm driving down the freeway and throwing some interesting hand signals at other drivers on the road and sharing my thoughts in a really aggressive manner, and maybe driving in a way or just reacting in a way that's like, wow, why am I in a completely red state when I feel like, as a general rule, I'm very egalitarian and in that green space? Like, do you have ideas about how a person could work on this process of integrating different capacities from levels of development?
To me, what comes to mind is the idea of self-awareness practices, because they can help you realize where you are, where your normal center of gravity is, which can help you reflect on where you've been. And hopefully, if you've spent enough time with self-awareness and reflection and compassion, you can look back at these stages of your life with a sort of loving kindness and see them for what they are. And when I don't know, when I'm able to do that, I am more easily able to relate with others who are in those stages, or have compassion for myself when maybe I'm not operating from where I think I need to, whether it's a red stage or an orange stage. Maybe sometimes I feel like I'm not accessing red when I need to, and sometimes vice versa, or sometimes orange. So it helps you with positioning and realize what stage might be helpful in any given situation. And it helps you to feel grounded in where you are and open to the challenges, kind of letting go of your identity and working into a new stage so that you can have more perspectives. I don't even want to say letting go of your identity, because that creates this idea of separation, but it's I get this image of like eating yourself, like you're eating this past version of yourself for nutrients to become this bigger version of yourself. I don't know where that lands.
I guess it makes me think of the image of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. There's this circular nature, this kind of cyclical experience of digesting and integrating and then evolving. I think, like, your example of red makes me think about a simple question of what's my relationship with the experience of anger. For me, for a lot of my life, I've carried this internalized message that there is something intrinsically, even morally or ethically wrong with the experience and expression of anger. But anger actually serves a really important purpose. Anger helps us to set boundaries. Anger helps us to advocate for change. And when we're in right relationship to anger, we have a capacity to do that from a very grounded, centered place, rather than what we often associate with a spontaneous red moment, a spontaneous, aggressive, dominance-oriented experience where we're out of control. We're more blended with anger rather than a right relationship to it. And I think you could do the same thing with any of these levels, right? Like, I think about, am I in right relationship to the experience of ritual from purple? Or am I in right relationship to the importance of individual development from orange? We could really, I think, maybe look at any of these stages and say, what are some really core capacities here that a person would want to develop and integrate as part of their own vertical development, their own vertical trajectory?
That's beautiful. I love the idea of focusing on the values of each level or altitude or meme of spiral dynamics, of human development. To me, focusing on the values helps like that would be something I take away from this episode is how do I work through this and how do I work with others when I focus on the values of each state. It helps me to hold that compassionate space. It helps me to realize that each stage or each center of gravity has value to the whole picture, which makes it a lot easier to work with, whether I'm struggling with that level within myself or within others, whatever it might be. Looking at the value seems to me a really helpful tool.
I wonder if you'd be open to a little bit of a thought experiment around it.
Let's do it.
I'm really interested because I feel like let me catch myself here. Because spiral dynamics is both individual as well as collective. Like we can apply this to any level of human experience. I wonder if we look at green as what appears to be where, at least in the United States, socially, where there's a strong presence for, and we say, like, how do we see green expressed right now, and what are some of the challenges that we're seeing in the expression of green, and then what would be required for us to begin to move from green into
What's coming to mind for me, an emphasis on equality of rights and I mean, it's been a struggle for a long time, equality of rights, but it seems like voices are really finding strength and power right now for equality of rights. And it almost seems like there's this struggle between the green way of thinking that our US culture is trying to embrace and work toward and grow into. And there's resistance from past ways of operating. You know, we've come from a hierarchical culture, and so equality is a big change. And I think that sometimes the feeling of urgency from the voices in these equality movements, which is totally like, there seems to be this dismissal of past ways of thinking. There needs to be some break from it for growth to happen, but it seems like if there's a complete dismissal of people who think a certain way, our collective consciousness struggles to really grow into this next level of development. We kind of stay stuck and stagnant because we haven't integrated those past levels. We haven't really embraced our past and seen the value in it. There's mostly just a complete denial of what those states or perspectives are. That's what comes to mind for me.
You have some examples that you see that are coming up right now of developmental capacities that are being rejected or denied?
Yeah, I mean, just in the struggle, you know, there's a reach for, or like a call for US culture to have a more collective mentality. For example, women's rights movements, Me Too, a lot of like voices coming up against celebrity or political sexism, basically, or women's repression. This is kind of a tricky area. Sorry. Forgive me for
That's okay.
in wanting to
It does feel tricky, right?
in wanting to speak up for voices that have been at the bottom of a hierarchical society, that have been shoved to the bottom. There can be this kind of collective voice that seems to come out where it's like, all right, well, these people are worthless, are trash, are scum of the earth, and therefore they need to not be in power anymore. They need to, like, women need to take over. You know, there's just kind of this, you can feel this overextension that just leaves behind a more power-based dynamic or a power-based perspective. And I am not, I guess I should make it clear that I'm not necessarily advocating for I'm not advocating for domination of women by any means, but I do you can sense that there's this shoving away people and perspectives rather than call like a feeling of integration, of welcoming, of who everyone is. So I think this type of dynamic that happens where we're still shoving away others prevents us as a collective from stepping into a more integrated space together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really appreciate that perspective on it. The nature of what we're experiencing right now in this stage of collective development is a movement from orange into green, where part of the function of that development is to look backwards in time and say, what are the ways that we are not currently from the past moving into the present, living up to the kind of core capacities of this stage of development, meaning an egalitarian view of the world? What are the ways that we still experience hierarchy in organizations, in social relationships, and like what are the power dynamics that are still present, and where one group is exercising power and domination over another group? There's also, I feel like there's like what is often referred to as kind of the new agey stuff, where we have this attempt to integrate stuff from like even like purple, right? This tribal space. In some ways, we also have that shadow creeping in and kind of other developmental spaces, because it does feel like there's a little bit of a war between facets of society that are still very rooted and are still very present in a like blue or orange level of development that are really feeling that tension, which is really hard. But I guess it just makes me think, like, at least from my own experience, I find one of the aspects of spiral dynamics that I'm working to integrate right now would be like coming into right relationship with blue capacities. That's an aspect that it feels very tricky for me right now. But that also seems to be present kind of culturally too. And you start getting into any kind of those topical conversations and how explosive they can become. Feels like what we have here is a need to integrate something from that level that's not currently present. I just wonder, what would be, from your perspective, what would be required to move from, why don't we say, orange into green? Like, what would be the developmental journey to move away from orange into green, and then maybe even from green into yellow?
Moving from orange to green requires one to basically get to a point of focusing enough on themselves to feel accomplished in the way that that makes them ready to move on to the next level. Yeah, just, I guess, just putting your all into the orange when you're there, and really going for it, just doing what you can. And people say that they just, after a certain amount of success, you just naturally come to this point of wanting to connect with something bigger and to give back to your community. It seems like that's kind of a natural pattern that happens after you've just experienced orange long enough. But it's also a matter of situation, life circumstances. Sometimes life just happens and, you are challenged more, and it is harder to work through stages. And you might even not be able to operate at stages that you've previously been able to operate from. It might make it harder for you to access stages that you've already reached. So sometimes it can be challenging based on our circumstances, but it seems like just really surrendering to the stage you are in, and at the same time learning from your past, integrating your past, and looking beyond, challenging yourself to possibly be around people who think in this perspective that you haven't yet been able to integrate. I find that being around people and just really soaking them in, learning who they are, connecting with them helps me to integrate those aspects with myself. So switching from individual to community, and then the shift from green to yellow, this does require a bit more, it seems. Instead of just switching from individual to collective and back, you kind of have this stage where you reach this stage where you can hold all of these different perspectives. So to me, that means that you are active in reflecting on the interactions you have, the way that you behave with people, the thoughts that you have, and you can see where you are in all of that and how you affect others with all of that and try to maintain. So it just takes a lot of conscious effort, I think, and practice, reflection, compassion to be able to make that jump.
I guess I'm hearing a lot of the importance of curiosity each of the stages, especially moving into green and then from green into yellow. Is it just from what you were describing, from orange to green, shift seems to happen when I have enough individual success that I begin to be able to think about other people. That's where the shift starts to happen. And it seems like a tenet of green is almost a component of advocacy that's happening, where I'm advocating for social change, and I'm taking the success that I've acquired up to this point, and I'm then leveraging that success as a way to advocate for change, moving towards this space of an egalitarian mind. And then within that space of green, like kind of in that developmental space, getting really curious about the lived experience of other people. What is it? Like I think about some of the social justice causes that have arisen in the past few years. I'm trying to be kind of careful here, but I'm just thinking about those. And then I'm thinking about the counter movements that have shown up. And what it feels like is that there is a real lack of curiosity there, where as I look at the interplay, it's very much a I'm right, you're wrong space of advocacy, which I think in order for somebody to move from green into yellow, you've got to really resolve that. You've got to really integrate that black and white, I'm right, you're wrong piece, which feels very connected to a much lower space of development, like very much like a level, like a blue space, like a blue mindset of like black and white, I'm right, you're wrong. But when we're trying to advocate for some social change, but we're doing it from a place of blue, it doesn't really work well. And you can't really get into space of flexibility and integration and systems development in yellow if you're still in that black and white frame of mind, because you're just not able to see things well enough to be able to do that. It feels like one of the antidotes that you were describing is this quality of curiosity that needs to be present, where I can sit down and say, I'm going to bracket my own stuff and be real curious about your lived experience without putting my own crap in the conversation in this way until I really understand. And once I really understand, then I can start to work with this person because I've demonstrated enough curiosity to come to an understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Curiosity does feel like just a main point of what needs to exist, especially going from green into yellow. That's first tier into the second. Everything in tier one, from my understanding, does have to some level that black and white thinking. Even green, which is very it's the most communally minded of that tier. It's still pretty black and white of this is the way we should all think, or people do think like me, just naturally, thinking that this is how it should be. So I kind of envision this spiral, and I'm seeing a person on each level of the spiral. From beige to green in tier one, I see each person calling out what they see around the spiral, what they can see from their perspective. But they're all just yelling over each other and saying, no, this is what is out there. This is what I see. Whereas yellow or turquoise levels, which are in tier 2, are listening to everyone and hearing what everyone sees and trying to put together this collective idea and also trying to communicate to everybody at each tier that this is as much of the picture we have together. What can we make of this? So that curiosity really does feel important for that shift.
Yeah, I really appreciate that visual of people standing on the spiral yelling over each other. It evoked this thought or sense around the importance of the environment that's being created individually, but then also in whatever group community we're a part of, that really nurtures the needs of these lower developmental stages. Just because in order to develop, like, we have to go through each of these stages, and depending on the environment that we find ourselves in, that may happen very rapidly, and it may also happen very slowly. I mean, if you grow up in a world where you don't have your basic needs met, it's going to be really hard to get out of beige and purple. If you're worrying about having enough food or enough water, or you're worrying about having clothes, it's going to be next to impossible for you to really be thinking about, like, science and technology development. Like, it's just because you got to figure out food and shelter. So I think that's an important thing to realize, is that if we are wanting to develop, there are needs that have to be met individually, but then also collectively. Like, obviously, one person isn't going to be able to do this on a large scale, but we can work in our community to influence needs and say, oh, okay, what is a need that's present? Because there's a certain, like, pull that is exerted in the spiral. There's like a gravitational force is exerted, where if collectively our group is at a higher level of development, it's going to pull us up very quickly. But also, if we have now exceeded the development of our group, that also exerts a certain gravitational force to pull us back down. And so if we want to affect some change there, we've got to consider that and say, what are the needs that are being present? Like, I live around, like, where I live, there are a lot of older individuals that are in a place where they have to start considering some much more basic needs again. And because they have to consider some more basic needs, like, there's a certain gravitational pull of that sinks them a little bit deeper. Like, I've seen people who have spent the last 50 years maybe in a more orange space, firmly, and their center of gravity is firmly in blue, and everything is black and white again, and everything is about, like, being really in this space of fundamentalist belief structures. And it's curious. But then when I look at where they're at in their life situation, they're also considering a lot of beige oriented concerns. I think that's another piece, is like, when we need to consider creating an environment where needs can be met so that compassion can be present and curiosity can be present.
That does feel an important part of spiral dynamics. The theory itself is just this idea that you can't force change, and the more you try, the more that means the less you're willing to integrate with people where they are, or with aspects of yourself where those aspects are. So having that compassion, holding that, it really is about focusing on what space can I provide. If you're really wanting positive development and growth for yourself or others, it is a matter of holding a compassionate space and asking what is needed here. What is needed for this level to be fulfilled, to be satisfied in a way that promotes natural growth, natural development, rather than I'm at an orange space and I want the blues to think like I do. I'm going to try to force the people who are centered in blue to come up to the orange space with me. That's kind of a more selfishly oriented position, but if you can hold that compassionate space of meeting people where they are or meeting yourself where you are, that actually facilitates the development the most.
That's so hard though.
It's so hard. It's so hard. I struggle with it. I do. Yeah, because you're just constantly going through all of these different things in this complex world that challenge you. So relationally, it can be really hard to meet someone where they are, to keep awareness of yourself, to know where you are and what's in your shadow. It is tough. It's really tough. And it just takes a matter of practice, though, I think, and continual effort. And I think that it's worth it. To me, it's worth it putting in that effort, because as you integrate with and embrace more parts of yourself and can really see the aspects of yourself, and you can see what opportunity for growth you have, what developmental edges you have, it becomes easier to operate freely in life and to relate with others and to just flow more fluidly. And you just have access to these different perspectives. So for any given situation, you have more tools in the tool belt, so to speak, of how you can react. Maybe for this situation, I need to access red. If I've integrated it well enough, then it comes up in a way for that situation that I need it to. And it's not this overkill of red reactivity. It's like a grounded red response that is needed for the moment. So it is hard, but the more you practice, I think, and the more effort you put into it, the more you start to feel that sense of freedom. But it's not a linear journey by any means, I don't think. Like, I've seen one day I'll be feeling like I'm moving up in the spiral, and one day I'll be feeling like I'm moving down. So it's harder when you think of it as a linear progression that only goes up, and that you fail if you're not going in that direction, or if you're stagnant for a little while. I think that pressure to constantly develop can make it more challenging, or to constantly expect development from others, which is perhaps partially a youth culture thing. But I think just our natural tendency is to want to develop, which is good, but to hold space for stagnancy, or even accessing or reacting from stages that maybe you're not wanting to in that moment.
I really like the point that you brought up about finding your growth edges. It's like there's this real need for self-compassion on this journey, right? Like you're saying, there's not a linear progression. I think that's a very socially, like a sociocultural normal mindset to have in the Western world right now, that everything's a straight line. And here we're talking about a spiral, and that invokes a lot of the nuance of growth and the importance of self-compassion. Like, you can't have compassion for other people if you don't have this self-compassion, which is really different than the way that I was raised up. Like for me, like growth was through discipline, and discipline was all about discipline through like punishment. That's what I'm looking for. And punishment is not compassion. And I can be really dedicated to growth without punishing myself, but I can instead have some compassion and realize that a spiral is very different than a straight line. And the other image that comes to mind for me is that, like, sometimes when you look at the spiral model, sometimes you're moving forward, but sometimes you're moving backwards, at least which direction I'm facing relative to my upward trajectory. Sometimes I'm facing the opposite direction. Like I'm in that sacred dark where things are going to be really hard. I'm dealing with some complexity here that it needs some space. I'm on the opposite half of the spiral. I need some space, and I need some time, and I need some compassion to be able to see what my system is trying to integrate, and to be able to give it the space for that to happen, to give myself the compassion to allow it to happen, and then to have some real dedicated effort to working with it. And then realizing that sometimes that integration is going to it's going to pull me backwards a little bit. There's a gravity to it. It's going to feel like I'm going backwards because I'm facing the opposite direction that I'm wanting to be in. And it's also, I think, helpful to realize in that same vein, it's not a race to the top.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the main points that is made with Beck and Cowan, who kind of are the spearheads of spiral dynamics behind Claire Graves, but one of the main points that they make is that maturity is not this ultimate end goal that is finally obtained and then you just never leave it. It's not. That's kind of this mythical idea that we have. So in a way it's like, oh, I'll never be just stay in this beautiful whole space where I can hold everybody appropriately. So there's this feeling of like sadness of letting go of that myth, but at the same time there's so much freedom that opens up because you realize, wow, I'm reaching for something that I can't obtain, that perfect version of myself that will never access other levels. And really, you can't achieve perfection by only accessing one level. Even if your center of gravity moves towards turquoise and reaches that level, you still need to access and utilize the other levels, otherwise they're no longer integrated. So holding that space for the different levels, the different stages, like you said, of facing backwards and forwards, so to speak, or being in the shadow or the light of development, those are all just a continual part of the process. Another idea that came to mind right now is that the spiral is a cycle. I mean, you're going through these continual cycles, and I almost picture a tornado where it's not always going up. You're kind of swirling around up and down. I mean, I've never been in the middle of a tornado, but I imagine that it's not just one continual swoop up, and it's kind of more chaotic than that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if the Wizard of Oz is any inclination to what it's like, you might get hit with a cow or a house while you're in there. So
Development can feel like that.
it really can. It's really hard sometimes, right? Like there's a reason there are things that we have to integrate. Like I love Robert Bly's, like the long bag we carry. I think that's what it's called. I mean, it's just this real beautiful piece about how as we grow up, like we have all these things that we're told in one way or another that aren't allowed or aren't appropriate. And we stuff those things into this bag that we carry behind us. And then we spend basically the rest of our lives after a certain point trying to unpack that bag. Some of those things are really beautiful gifts that we have that we're trying to unpack, but we also have a message that they're not okay. Some of those things are in there from traumatic experiences. Like it's a really challenging process to be able to integrate stuff. Plus, we're doing it outside of a vacuum. We're doing this in real time with live experience, which is a constant melting pot of stimulus where maybe we're trying to work on something because we just think, hey, I really want to work on this. And then in the process of that, someone touches on this real deep wound that you have inside. And now all of a sudden you're in the middle of chaos because you've got some unresolved trauma that is now present, fully engaged in the psyche, and you are just in a world of hurt. And you're like, and meanwhile, you're like, I'm just trying to figure out, like, how do I advocate from a beautiful place? And now I'm dealing with this horrible stuff from my childhood, or, this car accident where I almost died, or whatever. So it's really hard. Sometimes you really do feel like you get hit by a house as you're trying to integrate stuff. It's just really hard. Well, what do you feel like is missing? What do we still need to address?
The spiral wizard. We forgot about the spiral wizard.
You can't forget about the spiral wizards. The ultimate tool to facilitate cultural development through the spiral dynamics, like model, the spiral wizard. Yeah, I mean, do you want to break it down? Like the spiral wizard, what is it? What do they do? I mean, it's an evocative image. I love it. Maybe not for everybody. Maybe not everybody wants to be a wizard, but I love it.
Maybe not, but you could take it and run with it. We'll throw it out there, and then you can fill in your own your character that helps you. Yeah, the spiral wizard is just this idea that Beck and Cowan put out in their book on spiral dynamics. And it's just a person who can think from the place of the second tier. And so you try to operate from that place. And as far as I understand, you don't necessarily have to have your center of gravity there, but as a spiral wizard, it's almost as if you're advocating for the development toward that space. And you just know you surrender to the flow of natural development. And so you don't try to force change. You can hold multiple perspectives sometimes, maybe, and you're working toward gaining the ability to hold multiple perspectives. And you start thinking more in terms of not just yourself or a localized group, but you think in terms of the greater system and how we all operate together. So the spiral wizard is just this magician who can kind of just hold the magic of the spiral, so to speak, and advocate for the magic of the
Yeah.
spiral.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the way it's even worded in the book. I wanted to actually just read a chunk from it.
Yeah.
Because of the way it's worded and the imagery that's evoked. Spiral wizards instinctively roam over vast landscapes, seeing patterns and connections others do not notice because their old paradigm first tier filters do not allow them to. They can move through the spine of the spiral, awakening, unblocking, empowering, or repairing each of the genetic or cultural codes of an organization. Such a wizard appreciates chaos and thinks more like a creative designer than a re-engineer. Yeah. Thriving in chaos, creative designer. Yeah, it's like, for me, it makes me think about Gandalf. He has this vision. He has this understanding of what's going on. Like, I think about Gandalf in The Hobbit specifically, when he first meets Bilbo Baggins, and he sees where Bilbo is. He also sees what is necessary for Bilbo to move through his own individual development. But he also sees the Thorin's company of dwarves, and he sees what they need to move through their collective and individual development. And then he has this creative design process where he brings them all together and helps them through this quest. Like that's what comes to mind for me. Which, that story is really evocative if you see it through the lens of how could this really be a story of individual and collective development? And then how could I take the role of Gandalf in that space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great image. It helps for me to have images like that. Not just a spiral wizard, but to have that storyline and that background to attach it to. Because you get, it helps solidify the idea that Gandalf was able to see many perspectives, many people where they are, meanwhile trying to facilitate something, but never do you get the feeling, maybe not never, he might be forceful sometimes, but but it feels like he's kind of going with the natural flow of things. And there's not so much of that drive doesn't stem as much from I want things to be this way, but I see the whole system. I see where it's about to break. I see where it's about to require some change and some strength, and so it's just kind of facilitating the next level of development. Yeah, great image.
Yeah, I feel like you could really do a deep dive on Gandalf as a spiral wizard.
Next episode.
I guess it really just makes me think of some of these other wizardly characters. Like, could Merlin be an example of a spiral wizard? I mean, Dumbledore comes to mind. Mm-hmm. You look at the world of Harry Potter and you look at Dumbledore, especially at the very beginning of the first book and even throughout, it's really interesting. You see an example of behavior, like attitudes and behavior that we might associate with the purple tier. For example, the moniker "He Who Must Not Be Named." Everyone is so superstitious of using Voldemort's name, except Dumbledore isn't. And he doesn't make a huge deal out of it. He doesn't necessarily chastise people. I think he has about as strong of a conversation with someone as you really ever see him have at the very, very beginning of book 1 when he's talking to Professor McGonagall about it. But you look at how Dumbledore interacts with people, and it's like there's this playfulness, there's this curiosity and creativity, and he's just as likely to teach you magic as he is to talk about knitting or lemon drops. And there is this real deep well of wisdom that he has, but it's always in the service of system change and helping people develop. So I feel like you could do a deep dive there as well of like, how could you see Dumbledore through this lens of the Spiral Wizard?
Love it. A whole Spiral Wizard episode.
Could be awesome.
One thing I was going to add is just on that Spiral Wizard and acknowledging the challenges of breaking through tier 1 into this kind of Spiral Wizard tier 2 way of thinking. I was thinking about why we have these really strong characters in our stories that represent this tier 2 level of thinking, but it is hard for us to access it even in our leaders in reality. And I was just thinking of something I read about spiral dynamics that said that leaders are the appropriate leader for a group that is willing to change is a half step above the center of gravity of that group. So if a group is in stage or is kind of more centered around an orange stage or state of being, the best leader for them that they would be the most open to would be someone who is switching or in between orange and green, is kind of floating in that space. Whereas if that group is closed off to change, they want their leader to kind of be in that state with them. So an orange group that is closed off to change and is not ready for the next level of development and still feels that they have more to obtain, they want a leader who is orange. And so there's also there are these barriers that we have to development that seem natural where we aren't ready for that that tier 2 leader yet. And so it's this beautiful ideal that we hold, and it's kind of this story that's meant to help us feel connected to the path of development and to feel like the possibilities that we can obtain potentially, but just noting that we might not yet be ready for that leader, for that spiral wizard to be our president, for example.
Yeah, that's such an interesting idea. I wasn't super familiar with that idea before, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think especially within some of the more social issues we're dealing with at this particular season, makes a lot of sense where some of the chaos and tension is. As well, I think it's really a cool thing to be able to say, like, who are the leaders that we are choosing or advocating for? And what does that tell us? Like, how can that be a mirror back to us about where we are in our own development? Mm-hmm. As well as how could we take that as an invitation to maybe form a community around support, like maybe a smaller community that provides a certain structural support to our efforts to grow based on where we are developmentally.
Yeah, and I wonder if part of the struggle that we have, let's say politically, since I brought up presidential leaders, for example, part of the struggle that we have might be just two different perspectives that are still in the more black and white space, trying to find an advocate that adequately reflects their perspective, which is really hard because we're all floating around anyway. So, but it's like we want this person to represent where we personally are centered in this moment in our life. And it does seem like we have really strong voices from different levels, just yelling out the perspectives that they see from their altitude.
Yeah, which is so hard. So much tension around it. So much confusion sometimes around it. Really highlights the importance of developing those capacities for compassion and curiosity and helping people with that.
Yeah, and I think focusing on our common values feels really important getting down to the values of what it is we all need and want. Even though we have different motivations and values at each stage, there are still some common ones that we all share. And so hopefully working through that.
Yeah, it is so important, right? To be able to come together as a community and really share in those things together and support each other in those things, clarify those things. Which honestly, I mean, it's a huge motivator for me behind the podcast is to be able to create that kind of space where people can come together, share together, provide that structural support of clarifying values and supporting each other in growth, really providing like a gathering place, like a campfire than a mile marker.
Yeah, that's a great image. A campfire.
Hopefully something where people can come together and share with each other and just say like, hey, I'm really interested in moving forward. I'm interested in developing individually and collectively. And I hope you are too. And let's work together.
Yeah, that's the perfect thing. The perfect focal point. Well, to all of our listeners, thank you for joining us here on The Fertile Dark. I really enjoyed diving into spiral dynamics with you. We hope that you found some value here today and were able to tap into your own spiral wizard. We would love to hear more about your own experiences, questions, or thoughts on spiral dynamics, and we invite you to connect with us through email or social media. We also welcome you to rate our show, subscribe, or tell us what you'd like to hear about next. Your feedback and comments help us to connect with you and to provide content that is relevant, so we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks again for joining us, and until next time, keep delving deep and embracing the journey.